Thanks, Mike. So today we have two guests with us, and they are already both in the room because they are East Coasters, and so that makes things a little bit easier. Our first one up this morning is Jihyun Oh. Jihyun, will you raise your digital hand so that it pushes you to the corner? She is the director of Mid-Council Ministries in the Office of the General Assembly. And so she will be talking with us about options for parish ministry that she has seen around the country and things that might not have occurred to us, although we might be some of the people who have generated some of those options that she's now seen. The other one is Tim Cargal. He is the Associate Director for Ministry Leadership Development, which are fancy words for he gets folks from when they think they might be ministers to when they actually are ministers. And he does the legwork on the national end for things like national ordination exams and guiding CPMs through the process, both what is required by the Book of Order and also what are good ideas, even if they're not required. So they will be your guides today. One more person I want to introduce, because even though you definitely got a chance to meet him on Tuesday, we didn't give him front and center profile. And so today I have asked if he'd be willing to lead us in devotions. And that is the Synod stated clerk, Michael Wilson. There he is. And Michael has been with us for about 1.5 years now. Right. He is, if you remember Wayne Yost, he is the new Wayne Yost of the Synod and has been doing terrific work, especially in developing the relational network of stated clerks around the region. So in particular, if you either are a stated clerk or are in close work with your presbytery stated clerk, Michael is kind of the first backstop for when those kind of things become important. So I'm going to go ahead and just hand it over then, the platform for Michael to lead us in spirit and in truth.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome. We're delighted that you are here. And Tim and Jihyun, thank you so much for being with us today. So grateful for your work and for your time with us. I thought since we're thinking about pastoral models, pastoral training, how people become leaders for the church, that this morning I would begin just by sharing with you a little bit from Luke 10 and a couple of reflections from me on Luke 10. To do that, I'm actually going to share my screen with you and let you look at a picture. This is I couldn't find the exact. I'll go ahead and share it. I couldn't find the exact kind of source of this to give it to you, but you can see here a little bit more of maybe of a Greek Orthodox picture. You can see Jesus with the two hands raised there. This is Jesus getting ready to send out the 72, or maybe this is the group picture after they came back, right? This is the class is over. We all gather around and take a picture of us together. So I'm going to leave that up and just invite you to now listen for God's word here in Luke 10. After this, Jesus appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. I am sending you out like lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if a person of peace is there, your peace will rest on that person, but if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move around from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you, cure the sick who are there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you. Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near. They go out, and then just a couple verses later, it says, the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, in your name, even the demons submit to us. He said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. Indeed, I've given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions and over all power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Friends, that's I think the word of the Lord for us today. Just a couple of reflections from me as we just think about what's going on around us. The first is that just really interesting phrase that Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There's a note of hopefulness there in terms of the possible good that can happen. And for us, particularly those of us who are often in the work of finding pastors for congregations and wondering from whence they will appear and what they will do and how they will happen, to recognize that we're not the first in the story of the church and the work that we do to look around and say, where the worker is going to come from. And that is happening at the presbytery level as we look for pastors. It's happening at the congregational level. I've sat with a number of sessions as people do look around. They go, now who's going to volunteer and who's going to lead and who's going to be on the session? And Jesus' answer to that is to pray and ask for God to send out, to send those workers. I myself have sat with sessions and wondered, where will we get leaders? And those of us who have been on PNCs or served as research of PNCs have probably said the words that this will happen in God's time, and it probably won't happen as fast as any of us want to. And I think there we are in that same story. The second, and this is one of the reasons I'm so grateful for Tim's work, is this all is set in the context of training people to do Jesus' kingdom work. And here is Jesus doing that with first 12, that's the after this, and now these 72. And I think we stand in that line of figuring out how that's going to happen. And then just one more thing for me, which is at the end, Jesus says to them, no matter what happens, and he says there's going to be times that are happy and times that are challenging, and they return actually pretty joyful. Their rejoicing is that we're participating in God's good work, not even the work we do, but we're participating in God's good life. And my hope is that part of what happens today for us is that we're encouraged in that and prepared for all that's ahead for us, whether it's delivering healing, whether it's wiping off dust, whether it's peace coming on us, or whether it's us delivering the news that the kingdom of God is near, which we continue to trust. So we're glad that you're here today, and we're glad for this training and the ways that we can be shaped for our work on preparing ministry leaders and supporting congregations and ministry leaders. Would you pray with me? God, we bless you for this day and for the people that have gone before us, for the ways that we've been sent out and prepared to do the work that's ahead of us. We thank you for those people who support us, particularly the Office of the General Assembly and their good work. And we pray our blessing upon our colleagues who are here with us today. And ask God that as we're together, we might truly be equipped to support those preparing for ministry, to support congregations and leaders in ministry, and to support one another in this day, in this space. In Jesus' name, amen. And first, maybe I'll send it back over to you, although maybe you're going to just say, do it to Jihyun, but I'll let you say that since you know what's next.
Fair enough. Thanks, Michael.
Yep.
Yeah. We've already introduced Jihyun. I think that anything else that I might say about her would be less valuable use of time than whatever she would say herself. So let's go ahead and give it over to her. Thank you, Jihyun, for being willing to be here, and thank you for making the clock transition from Denver time, where you just came from the Board of Pensions, presentation back to Eastern time with us. I know that can be a little more abrupt than going the other direction. So welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you, and I'm happy to be able to talk a little bit about the different sort of ways that we might think about congregational leadership, as many places within the denomination, many congregations, many faith communities are asking the question, what does congregational leadership look like now? And maybe it doesn't look like the way it used to in the past. And so how do we start thinking about that in a different way, give ourselves some more options, think about expanded possibilities. So I'd love to start our time. I'll start sharing my screen. I just have some slides just for in case some people actually learn better by seeing some words on the screen versus just listening. But hopefully it'll be more of a sharing and talking. And then also if you have questions along the way, we might be able to engage in some conversation. So just, I know this is a lot of folks in the room, and so we can't go around and hear from everyone, but I would be interested in hearing for some of you who might be coming in with some pressing questions about congregational leadership, what some of those questions might be. And if that's just like a sentence or two that you'd like to share as we sort of begin to gather in this room, I'd love to hear that.
If anyone wants to share, they can raise their digital hand or put it in the chat.
So no pressing questions about congregational leadership. Well, maybe there will be some other questions that come up along the way.
I see some now.
Oh,
one in the chat, we need ways to support the WeKirks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sorry, go ahead. Or David Stammerjohn.
Thank you. That essentially was my question too. I was phrasing it differently. Many small churches in this presbytery, and we are struggling to find leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Two more in the chat. Concerned about the difficulty of finding pastors in non-urban settings, and also thinking about how difficult it is getting to find pastors for small rural churches.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So I hope that we'll what I'll cover, I'll start off with some of the sort of congregational leadership models that are really familiar to many of us. I wanted to highlight some of those because I think also there are sometimes ways that we think about constraints about those positions in some different ways. So wanted to make sure that we covered those, but also we'll talk about some other ways to think about supporting the smaller congregations, the rural congregations, some interesting experiments that are happening in different parts of the denomination and also in different parts of the world. Yeah, I appreciate that question. What resources are available to adequately equip lay leaders for the types of ministry many churches are seeking for preaching, worship, leadership, and pastoral care? So definitely talk about that as well. Well, thank you, and feel free to continue adding questions that may come up as we go along. But I wanted to put this the work of the COM and CPM in the context of the work of the presbytery. That the work of the presbytery in the Book of Order G303 actually states that the presbytery is responsible for the government of the church throughout its district and for assisting and supporting the witness of congregations to the sovereign activity of God in the world, so that all congregations become communities of faith, hope, love, and witness. And so the work of COM and CPM is really in that context of the presbytery's overall work, and the committee has been given, whether that's a separate COM or a separate CPM or both together, that y'all have been sort of asked to do that on behalf of the presbytery. To do the governing, to do the assisting and the supporting, also that congregations can be better witnesses to God's activity in the world, and the congregations become communities of faith, hope, love, and witness to the communities around them. And so part of what that means is that the presbytery, and in the case of the COMs and CPMs, that you're really helping to make sure that the word of God may be truly preached and heard. I think sometimes I sort of shorthanded and say truly preached, but it's also truly preached and heard by people. Provide that the sacraments may be rightly administered and received. So it's a both and, it's both the administration, but it's also the receiving of the sacraments. And then nurturing the covenant community of disciples of Christ, which is all the things that actually go into becoming that covenant community of making sure that our relationships are right. And so that may include things like the judicial process and conflict sort of resolution and response when there might be some harm or some other things that are happening in communities, which can be also part of the COM's work, to preparing people for ministry in all of its form, and preparing people for spiritual leadership. And so the work that you all are engaging in is in that broader context of what the presbytery is to be doing in relationship to its member congregations and member pastors. And sort of looking at that, the sort of last piece that was added into the chat, that in a theologically divided and really polarized society, churches and PNCs can struggle to find leadership that actually aligns more closely with their core beliefs, or also sometimes I think who can ensure that congregations who are divided themselves within the congregation itself can have conversations that are still highlight the differences that matter without actually making it a divisive thing. And so I think those are both challenges that we see now for sure. So thinking about some congregational leadership options that folks are really familiar with, right? The one is a PCUSA teaching elder or a minister of word and sacrament. And two ways that can sort of happen. One is the installed relationship. And we often think that installed relationships can only happen for an indefinite period of time, but that's actually not true. You can actually do designated term installed pastoral relationships. And so if you do have somebody who's installed, then again, they can actually be for, 2 years or 4 years or however many years you think that actually is needed by the church. And I think the sort of undergirding question, again, given what the work of the presbytery is what sort of congregational leadership does the congregation need, or what sort of spiritual leadership does the congregation need? And so for some congregations, it will be this PCUSA teaching elder in an installed relationship, whether that's for an indefinite period of time or for a designated period of time, because there may be certain things that need to be done in that time. That can be some additional transitional work. It could be some healing from things that have happened or great losses that have happened in the congregation. It could be that there's just some particular task that the congregation is needing to think about, or a transition that the congregation is needing to think about. And so those are times where it could be helpful to do a designated term instead of just an indefinite period. The other thing that we don't always think about in terms of installed relationships for teaching elders is that it can be full-time or part-time. We often think that all the installed relationships have to be indefinite and full-time, but that's actually not true. So there's some flexibility there. Again, thinking about what is the congregational leadership that the faith community needs. That might look really different. And of course, another option for teaching elder leadership is a temporary relationship, which is for a specified period not to exceed 12 months. Of course, it can be renewed with presbytery approval, and it can be part-time or full-time as well. And some of the sort of, I think, the latest figures that we're hearing, of course, is that we're probably have more now temporary relationships than installed pastoral relationships in congregations, or temporary relationships and other sorts of congregational leadership other than installed teaching elder relationships. So another option that I think we then often sort of think about when folks say, well, we can't either find a teaching elder, or that we seem to have some trouble actually connecting with a teaching elder that is a good fit for the congregation. Folks will often think about the commissioned pastor, a PCUSA commissioned pastor. So ruling elders commissioned to particular pastoral service is the way that it's termed. And I just want to highlight here that really, even though folks actually often think about commissioned pastors or ruling elders needing to be commissioned in order to do preaching and all of the pastoral service, that's actually not true. That the only things that ruling elders actually need commissioning for is the administration of the sacraments, moderating sessions, and then performing marriages where it's permitted by state law. So ruling elders can preach, they can do pastoral care. I think as one of the folks wrote in chat, can do the preaching, the worship leadership, the pastoral care without being commissioned. But we often think about commissioned pastors as sort of a another way of quote unquote filling the pulpit, as it were. And so that's another option that's there. And each presbytery will do something a little bit different with the commissioned pastor training and mentorship. But one of the things that I do want to highlight, and that we often like to highlight in OGA, is that one of the requirements for commissioned pastors is that they do have some sort of mentorship with by a teaching elder, so that they're actually getting some continued support and equipping as they continue to serve in their ministry settings. And then another option is finding a PCUSA candidate to be in a temporary relationship. So again, a period not to exceed 12 months, usually full-time or part-time. That candidate under care in the ordination process within the PCUSA can also be an option for congregational leadership. So those are some of the ones that we think about in terms of PCUSA folks, members. Some other ones that, especially I think in Pennsylvania, there may be a lot more presbyteries who are using some of these options, is a minister from a formula of agreement or full communion partner. And so for just as a quick review, the formula of agreement partners are the Reformed Church in America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and then the United Church of Christ are our full communion partners in the formula of agreement. And we also are in full communion with the Moravian Church and the Korean Presbyterian Church abroad. And so what that means is that for us to be in full communion, we recognize and the ministry of our ministers in full, and so they can, without transferring, be in installed relationships within our congregations. And so again, these installed relationships can be for a designated term or an indefinite period of time. It's governed by the orderly exchange documents, and it really is at the presbytery's invitation. And so it's really the job of the presbytery, in cases probably the COM, to determine whether there is a need for that person, a minister of a full communion partner, to come and help with the ministry of the presbytery. and then be invited into that relationship. And Maureen, they can I guess Tim, maybe you can help here. The sort of orderly exchange piece actually does talk about the installed relationship. They can be in there isn't anything that prohibits them from being in temporary relationships. But I think the sort of idea for the orderly exchange was to actually think about how can we actually do the installed relationships and do all of the things that we do for our teaching elders. Tim, is there anything that you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I would just point out that under orderly exchange, ministers of other formula of agreement partners can serve in any form of pastoral relationship that's available to a minister of word and sacrament in this church. So that would include the full range from temporary pastoral relationships to installed pastoral relationships of either definite or indefinite terms. And so there's just the fundamental unanimity. And so that's, they really can serve in any way that one of our own ministers could within our churches.
Thanks, Tim. It's helpful to have somebody who's been doing this longer. The ministry and the formula of agreement conversations to give some more clarity for that. And of course, in the case of any of the formula of agreement or full communion partners, an important reminder is that because we are in full communion with them, the transfers are not recommended, and really it's really about folks staying members of their denominations and still being able to serve as if they were PCUSA ministers in all of the congregational settings or faith community settings. And so sometimes we'll sort of get inquiries about, oh, we need to transfer in a formula of agreement minister. That's not necessary, and they can still be temporary members of the presbytery to be able to participate in the life of the presbytery. The other thing that we want to highlight is that this is not really for first calls. That one of the important things that we talked about in the formula of agreement ministry staff set table is it's so important for all of us to know what our own sort of denominational traditions are, in order to then go and serve in another setting where those traditions, those theologies, the sort of ways we govern ourselves may be a little bit different. But if we don't know fully who we are and have experience in that, then it's really hard to, I think, respect and follow and know what those differences are better in another setting. And so that's one of the reasons why there is a sort of piece of the orderly exchange that says this minister exchange is not for first calls. And so some of the resources that you have are the orderly exchange document, which is available for folks who would like to look through it. If you also are trying to support ministers who are looking for a call and they're also not necessarily finding a PCUSA congregation that works for their sense of vocation, then there are also some good guidance in that document for what that would look like for that minister to consider a call within the full communion partners as well. And of course, another resource that's available to you is the ministry staff that for the PCUSA, that's Tim Cargal and also Manuel Silva Estrich, who you met on Tuesday for the training. And so those are the two FOA ministry staff who deal with those orderly exchanges. And they can help answer questions that you may have if you just need to talk through or have some questions about how that works. They are also ready to help you. Then there's sort of the next other sort of another opportunity would be ministers of other Christian churches. And so these are the churches where we are not in full communion, but we are still in an ecumenical relationship of some sort. And so those pastors, unlike the formula of agreement pastors, can't serve in all the ways that PCUSA ministers can serve. So they would be in temporary relationships, and they can transfer or have temporary membership through the time of their service. One resource that I'd like to sort of highlight as you all are thinking about these possibilities is if you're thinking about a minister from another denomination, whether that's a domestic sort of denomination or an international denomination, we have a resource on equip.pcusa.org that is ministers of other denominations, and it's a really helpful flow chart that you can either see as a flow chart itself, or it also guides you through the process of decision making and process. So things like, do we need to think about immigration issues for a minister of another denomination? Do we have to think about then who do you contact in order to do that? Who do you actually contact in order to transfer membership? Who do you need to contact, or what sort of questions you need to ask about whether, what sort of preparation, what sort of things that you would actually need to think about in order to work through that transfer process, or helping folks to serve churches within the denomination. And let me see if I can find that link really quickly. Maybe Tim has easier access to that. Like he can drop in because mine is working a little bit slowly right now as I'm running this PowerPoint presentation.
Jihyun, I'll grab that URL and drop it in.
Yeah, thank you. So that is a helpful resource that many of us created together or worked on together to sort of think about that flowchart process, so that folks don't get sort of all the way to the end and realize, oh, we missed a step, or we forgot to ask some questions, and thinking about a minister who wants to come to the PCUSA and serve in some sort of way. And what we're hearing, at least from our manager for Immigration Legal Services, Teresa Wagner, is that we're actually seeing some interesting immigration patterns where we're seeing more ministers from the Church of Scotland, for example, who are wanting to come to the PCUSA because of some of the policies that they have put in place in their denomination. And so there may be some folks who are coming from different parts of the world, not necessarily the ones that we'd always assume are actually coming, who are wishing to serve in our congregations. Another resource that I want to lift up, so in cases of other sort of Christian churches, is that the ecumenical and interreligious relations area within OGA, that's Diana Wright is the director, and Sherry Hunter is the administrative assistant in that area. They can also help get in contact with those denominations in order to get connected about standing as well as transfers. And so those are good folks to be able to be in contact with. They'll also be able to sort of help you through thinking about, like, do they belong to a reform body, or do they reform to other Christian churches, where you might want to think about different sorts of preparation for people to serve in a PCUSA congregation in some way. So all of these, I think these models that I've talked about so far, the assumptions really are that there's one congregation, usually one minister or pastoral leader per congregation, or more. And that there, in some ways, there is a hierarchy of what is better pastoral leadership. And we often sort of go through the list and say, well, if we can do this, then we do that, that first one. Usually it's, I think, a teaching elder of a PCUSA. And then if we can't do that, then we go down the list of what the sort of pastoral leadership need is. But it may really be that the needs of the congregation are such that those assumptions are actually not the ones that are most helpful, but that we may want to actually start thinking about different ways that we meet that pastoral or congregational leadership need. I think there is a sort of an idea sometimes that, and I ran into this with a congregation that I was serving as an interim pastor, that when I was with them, I said, if you feel like the need is greater for you to have a part-time Christian educator and office administrator combination, be full-time and go 3/4 time with a pastor, then maybe that's because you feel like you need some Christian education support, then maybe that's the way that you need to go. And the folks in the congregation said, well, if we can't have a full-time pastor, it will mean that we have failed in some way. And so there may be some congregations that you're working with and to support where they may some congregations may be able to say that explicitly, and there's maybe some others where there's a feeling that somehow they failed, or in order to be a good congregation or the best congregation they can be, they have to have a particular form of congregational leadership. And so I hope that your work in supporting those congregations and those ministers might be to help them rethink some of those assumptions about what congregational leadership needs might look, meeting those needs might look like. And yes, David, I think the background checks on other denominations can be challenging. And so I think the reason why we sort of lift up getting in touch with our ecumenical and interreligious relations area is that they do have contact with those ecumenical officers of the various denominations, and know who to contact in order to get those standing letters and things like that. And so they can help you with some of those pieces. But it is challenging because I think our sort of the way that we think about standing can be a little bit different, or good standing can be different across the different denominations, and what sort of information comes back. So there are some options that we might have with some new assumptions. And so some of those things may be that there may be some congregations that need to start thinking about doing different sorts of partnerships, whether those are mergers, so that they can actually call one pastor or or seek one new congregational leader together. It could be that there is a congregation of another denomination that is nearby that folks can then be federated together as one congregation. There may be some congregations that say, we don't want to do the merger and become one or become federated, but we'd like to become yoked, so that we're also sort of sharing some of that decision making, but we're still going to be sort of worshiping in two separate places, but still want to have a shared pastoral or a congregational leader of some sort. And then there can also be that sort of parish model or circuit rider. That's actually more than. So some of the folks who have been doing that for a while are siblings in the United Reformed Church in Britain. They actually, many of the folks there serve something between 2 to 5 congregations as a sort of a parish model, and they have worked out ways to be able to do that sort of shared ministry together within that context. But another model that I would like to highlight today is a model that Southern Kansas is actually trying out. Some of you may have actually seen it written up in the Presbyterian Outlook. And so what they're saying is that for some of their congregations, the future will be pastoralist, and that is great news. Still, that still means a hopeful future for these congregations. And so what they're sort of, what they did in sort of looking at some of those congregations is to define or sort of look at what are the areas within Southern Kansas that are considered frontier areas. And so being classified as a frontier means having fewer than 6 people per square mile. And so that just means that there isn't that sort of population density to draw from. That actually sort of means that the congregation can grow numerically from its current size. And so then some of the economic factors start kicking in. But for those churches, they're okay to have ruling elder leadership and to be spiritual leaders together and sharing and becoming those communities of faith, hope, love, and witness in their community. And so the frontier is 6 people per square mile or less. And then they also sort of realize that a lot of their churches were also then classified as rural, and the rural churches have more than the sort of frontier population density, but still not so much population density that the congregations will grow numerically over time because there's just not the population to draw from. And so out of the 30 churches that are in those frontier and rural settings, they have 11 with PCUSA leadership of some sort. But what they've sort of decided is that they have a presbytery position, teaching elder who's on staff now in presbytery, and her job is to support and equip the leadership of these frontier and rural congregations that will not have a pastoral leader present week to week. So that sort of the question that somebody asked earlier of like, how do we actually equip the people who will do some of the preaching, worship leadership, and pastoral care without having a pastor or a teaching elder in place or a commissioned pastor in place? Well, that presbytery has said, we're not even thinking about circuit riders so that they have to have a pastoral leader go from week to week or, even 2 or 3 churches on a Sunday, but that there would really, the most consistent leadership would be the ruling elders and others who are actually in congregational leadership positions doing the work of the church together. And the job of the teaching elder is to equip those folks who are doing congregational leadership. And what they're finding is that a lot of those smaller churches that have sort of transitioned to that form of leadership, when you talk to them about how they're feeling about the church and their future, that they're feeling really hopeful, and they're feeling like they're really able to have a vibrant congregational life in ways that they maybe had not imagined before. So some of the options then that I think the way that Southern Kansas is doing it, and there are of course other denominations around the world that are doing this, where the teaching elder goes to different areas to again equip and teach and make sure that the spiritual leaders, most often ruling elders in those congregations, are equipped to do the ministry that they've been called to do. But again, within our own PCUSA polity, then if the ruling elders are the spiritual leaders doing most of the preaching, pastoral care, worship leadership, and other sort of mission and ministry activities alongside the rest of the congregation, then you could also then have others who are commissioned to moderate session or administer sacraments from time to time as needed by the congregation. And one of the things that I think is worth mentioning with the commission is that, and Tim and I talked about this last week with the Synod of Lakes and Prairies as well, that we often think about the commission as all or nothing sort of scenarios where we commission people to do the moderating the session, the administration of the sacraments, and the marriage pieces, and like the whole pastoral package is what we're commissioning to. But there may be some people who love moderating session meetings, but they don't really feel like they're called to administration of the sacraments. And so those folks may just want to be commissioned to moderate session meetings in different places within the presbytery. And there may be others who say, you know what, I have zero interest and I don't feel called to moderate session meetings at all, but really find so much meaning and passion in administering the sacraments, and so would love to be commissioned to that role. And so being able to think a little bit more flexibly about what sort of commission for what sort of role for what sort of person who feels called to and passionate about what sort of role may also help people to find more passion and more life as they're serving the church in different ways. And so, Bill, I really appreciate this idea that you're offering in the chat of the hybrid worship models of being on Zoom for session meetings, and also having somebody available to administer the sacraments. So for presbyteries where it feels like geographically you are spread out in such a way that this becomes really difficult, I think there are some options now post-pandemic that gives us some flexibility, where we've also worked out some of the theological pieces about how to do sacraments in a sort of a remote way, even as we share a meal across the technology virtually. Another, I think, thing that we often think about is that we sort of so let me just stop there, I guess, and see what other thoughts or questions people might have. Yeah, so thanks for that question. The compensation for the ruling elders who are commissioned but pastoring congregations. So I think in some of the congregations where the ruling elders are doing the spiritual leadership, I don't, I'd have to check, but I think it's really that shared ministry of the congregation, and so not necessarily pastoring per se. And so I think many of them, they're not doing a ton of compensation, if at all, because it's not sort of the one leader who does a lot of the stuff, but it's the spiritual leadership component, and then inviting the congregation to also share in the mission and ministry of the church. So some common hiccups, talking about alternative congregational leadership. It's a great question for us. I don't know if this is a hiccup necessarily, but I think we often fall into sort of economic, sort of capitalist abundance and scarcity sort of mindset that makes folks then feel like whatever choice is not the best choice, but it's just what we can afford. I guess I hear that conversation a lot. And I wonder if that then sort of often detracts from the good and faithful ministry that's happening and can happen within those congregational settings, versus saying, these are our congregational needs. These are the things that we need to do. So, for example, a congregation may say, we can actually cover the preaching among ourselves, but maybe we actually need somebody who can help us build better relationships with our community. So seeking a person who has those gifts, that may actually be sort of an alternative congregational leadership model, may mean that they're looking for different characteristics, but I think often I think we still tend to focus a lot on the preaching. And I think last week we sort of talked a lot about the sort of even the phrasing that we use of we have to fill the empty pulpits, being a primary task that COMs often talk about. And so that tends to then be the thing that we're often focused on as when we're looking for pastoral leadership of different kinds or congregational leadership of different kinds. And I don't know if that's always really helpful. I think also the other piece too is folks are thinking about different ways to think about pastoral leadership or congregational leadership is assuming that the preaching and hearing of the word always has to be like a sermon format that is preached from the pulpit too. And so there may be different ways of preaching and hearing the word. And some folks may feel really nervous about preaching and standing up and right, delivering a sermon or preaching a sermon for the 10 to 15 minutes or however long the expectation is within the congregation, but they may be really gifted at leading a discussion or facilitating a discussion or a Bible study or some other way of actually hearing the word preached and hearing it. So I think those are some of the pieces that I think often happen even in the conceiving of those alternative congregational models. I do think sometimes the sort of the polity pieces can trip people up if they don't check early enough. And then sometimes congregations can actually, especially if they're looking at other denominations, that they might really get attached to a minister, and the transfer process will be a little bit trickier than they have. Or I think too, the other piece is that if there are pastoral leaders or congregational leaders from other denominations, then how will the ruling elder training within the PCUSA happen? I think sometimes we're not really accounting for some of those pieces. So I don't know if I don't know if that answers the question that you were wondering about in terms of hiccups.
Jihyun, Maureen, right, has her hand raised.
Yeah. Yep. Maureen.
Jihyun, I may have missed a piece, but can we go back real quickly to the options with new assumptions and the person who asked about compensation?
Yeah.
We're talking about not necessarily ruling elders doing so in their own church, but maybe beyond their church, correct?
Oh, yeah, no, I think that this, this particular slide, I was actually talking about ruling elders within their own churches.
Okay.
Actually serving as spiritual leaders, so not being commissioned to sort of pastoral leadership in another church.
Okay,
But,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yes, and thank you for asking for the clarification. I'm probably not being as clear as I could have been about that. So yeah, so I'm looking at Jerry Lynn's question about the satellite ministry options, live stream preaching from larger congregations to satellite churches. Yeah, that's absolutely a possibility. There and some of the presbyteries, I think, are also offering, and your presbyteries may be as well, or some preaching videos that can be shared periodically, so that congregational leaders or places where folks may be rotating. Ruling elders may be rotating their preaching among themselves, but they maybe can do that for 3 of the 4 weeks out of most months, or they can do it for the 4 weeks, but maybe on the 5th Sunday, it's harder to actually find somebody in a rotation. They're also producing some of these from the presbytery side, so that folks can actually share those videos. And so it can be live stream preaching. I think it can also be video preaching in order to actually supplement some of the leadership that's already present within a congregation as well. And David, I appreciate the seminar to empower ruling elders to serve communion in the absence of an ordained or commissioned leader. And we have the theology and worship area within the Presbyterian Mission Agency has really good resources for that as well. And so for others who may be looking to do a seminar of that sort, in order to empower ruling elders to serve communion or to preach or do other things, there are, I think, a lot of different programs that are popping up within the denomination that are really looking to do that equipping of folks to be spiritual leaders within their own congregational context that would really help congregations to be more fully those communities of faith, hope, love, and witness in the world. So are there models of yoking across presbytery boundaries? That is a great question, David, and I'm not sure if I know of any. Are there any? Maureen, do you have some? Yeah.
We just have one, and it crosses over into Transylvania from where we are, which is Kentucky, for folks in Pennsylvania that don't know.
Yeah.
It came to us because the pastor was already yoked in that presbytery, but wanted to accept a call in one of our churches, but didn't want to leave this other church in the lurch. And so far, so good. Just takes some communication.
Yeah. So I would sort of imagine that the obstacles could be sort of around the accountability function, and like if they're yoked across presbyteries, and what does that look like? Maureen, I wonder if you would sort of reflect on some of that.
Yes. Here's the thing that I will say freely. I can't speak because this person is a member of our presbytery. And so we're not the ones confronted with some of that accountability issue. But I think you do have to think about, if something happens, how do you deal with that? Because the person isn't a member. If something would happen in the other presbytery, he's not a member of that presbytery. And that would take coordinating with our staff. But again, when you live in places where maybe that's the most convenient thing, or this just grew organically, then I think we have to make the effort because it's very isolated, to make it work for them. So but it's Transylvania, if anybody really wants to kind of explore that with them from that side.
Yeah. Thanks, Maureen. And Crystal, I see what you're saying about Carlisle doing that with Huntington for a pair of churches. And in some ways, I think some of the communication pieces might be a little bit like the accountability for formula of agreement ministers serving in our congregations, where if something happens, then you also have to talk to the other body, the other denomination, in order to actually figure out like who, just being really clear about. So if it needs to be an investigation, or if it needs to be some sort of conflict resolution, or some sort of care that needs to be offered, then just making sure that who is doing it, especially if since the yoke congregation, one exists in one presbytery and another one in the other. And the presbytery, the minister is a member of one, and not both. And so, right, how do those sorts of things actually get handled in terms of both accountability and care? Tim, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. I was actually going to make a point that you just made, so that's why. Was that the formula of agreement in the way that it handles supervision and oversight of ministers serving under orderly exchange can give you some really good models for how to think about that and how to carry that out.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Nancy, your question about commissioning ruling elders to moderate session in churches other than their own, absolutely, you can do that. And so it can really just be to moderate session meetings and to nothing else if it's just about that. And that's the need that you see. And so I think sometimes we lose some of that flexibility because we think about the commission as all one part of a package. But sometimes separating that out might mean that we're better able to meet the needs of various congregations. And so especially if you're having problems finding moderators for some of the session meetings, that might be the thing that needs to happen. And then I think so going back to that hiccups question, Forrest, I think we were discussing this, and Tim was sort of highlighting this in our discussion with Lakes and Prairies, COM and CPM last week, that now a lot of presbyteries have CRE or commission pastor training programs that sort of run the whole gamut of ministry in order to be commissioned. But for folks who are just needing to moderate session meetings, they probably don't need all that training in order to be commissioned to moderate session meetings if that's all that they're being commissioned to do. And so is there also some flexibility that needs to be built in to the training programs and the commission pastor programs if you start separating out some of those functions, so that folks are not having to do all of the things, but the things that they're particularly commissioned to do. Yeah, that's Jared, Lynn, that's a very good question. How will the presbytery deal with rogue preaching that is not uniting but dividing within the congregation? If congregational leadership is volunteer, or more people from within the congregation. So I think this is really where the presbytery, then I think the work of COM may need to be rethought a little bit too. How do you support congregations if more of your churches actually go toward the model that Southern Kansas is exploring, for example, with more people from within the congregation preaching? What sort of oversight, what sort of guidance, what sort of support, what sort of training? And I think that sort of relates to a question that was also asked a little bit earlier in the chat around whether people actually feel connected as to the PCUSA, or whether they're feeling pretty congregational. I think generally speaking, even though we are a connectional church, probably many of our congregations still function as Congregationalists a lot of times. And and so I think sort of there is a sort of a larger question of how are we helping folks to be connected to their Presbyterian identity and their membership as part of the presbytery. And again, especially if folks have had non-PCUSA congregational leaders, and then out of that group, ruling elders actually start doing the leadership. It may be that folks start to lose that sense of Presbyterian identity over time and that connection to the presbytery. And so what is that connection? What is that work of COM in particular, of connecting to those congregations, checking in, providing that sort of oversight, those sorts of things that would actually help folks to still feel connected and not like they're off by themselves doing their own thing. Yeah, so CRE is not having adequate polity training and leading sessions astray. Yes, Rhonda, that's a great question. We are in the process of trying to produce some polity 101 trainings in the 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Korean, because we're finding that some of the basic polity issues, I think for a long time we assumed that people sort of knew what Presbyterian polity was, and we're I think learning more and more that that's a really bad assumption to make. And so folks need to be trained and sort of invited into learning more about Presbyterian polity. And so there's a project that we are launching soon to try to produce some of those Presbyterian polity 101 courses. So in the meantime, there are some places that actually offer some polity training. And I wonder if like Savannah Presbytery has their School of the Laity program that they've been running for quite some time that includes like a 2-day history, polity, and mission course. And there are some remote participants in that. And so I don't know if looking for some of those programs that have been running for a while in different presbyteries and seeing if there's some ways that folks can engage in those so that it's not a full semester-long polity course, but it's still some of the basics. I did that polity course, the history polity and mission course for Savannah Presbytery over like a Saturday, Sunday sort of schedule last fall, and they have homework that they have to do. And like, it's one of the questions was sort of like an ordination exam, polity ordination exam. And they have to get feedback on it to get credit for it and things like that. And so I imagine that there's some of those other programs out there. If you all have ideas about what might be helpful for polity training for CRAs, we'd also love to hear about those so that we can either sort of produce or look for and curate and help you all get connected to some of those pieces. Yeah. So I'm looking through some of the other comments and questions. Yeah, Robert's Rules of Order, also for small congregations or small bodies. We tend to actually operate on the larger piece of more formal process, but there is also the small smaller body Roberts rules that can be used that give a little bit more flexibility, and folks are often unaware of that, and also just generally about Roberts rules. Yeah, and Maureen, that's a great point of how to do polity training over time so that it's not just you learn it once and then it sort of becomes hazy over time, or things change in the Book of Order. But people still think about it the way it was in the old form of government. Yeah, Geraldine, I really appreciate your question about how many congregations will actually want to be PCUSA congregations. One of the questions that Tim and I got asked several years ago was, how do we bring back a congregation into the presbytery fold? Because they'd had a Baptist minister serving them for a while, and they were sort of geographically a little further away and hadn't really come to presbytery very much and participated, but the COM was feeling this sort of renewed energy to try to bring folks back into the fold, and they were facing some resistance. And I think my reflection was sort of like yours. Are they actually Presbyterian anymore? Do they even want to be? And is that where you want to be expending your energy? Or is it time to also, let them join another denomination where they feel more connected, or where they feel like their sense of identity is more in line with? I think those are hard questions to consider, especially if presbyteries are also feeling like you're at the sort of beginning to get closer to the edge of the number of congregations required to be a presbytery. But that may, to your point, really help you to channel your resources in a way that's more impactful, that's faithful, that isn't also like trying to drag people who are kicking and screaming back into the community and communion, the covenant community that is the presbytery and the PCUSA. So there, I think, are some other pieces about this as you're thinking about pastoral leadership or congregational leadership. Also, how does the work of the COM start shifting a little bit too? The other thing that I would say is that one of the places where we do see congregational leadership models be quite flexible is with new worshiping communities. And I think we sometimes, maybe because it's sort of a startup culture there, those sorts of different models actually are easier to think about in some ways, or easier to accept in those places. And so I also wonder about looking to some of those new worshiping community ways of doing congregational leadership that may be helpful for our existing congregations as well. One of the, I had thought about doing a new worshiping community some years ago with a group of 3 other people. And our idea was that 3 of us would be gainfully employed full-time in other places. And then the one person who would be paid as a full-time staff person was the community relationship person, because that was what some of the new worshiping community idea was sort of based on. And that the person who was the primary preacher or the administrator or, those sorts of things would actually be gainfully employed in other ways. And so sort of doing a blended 4 pastoral leaders for a new worshiping community, but being supported by our outside work for most of us. So if you're, so there may be places where that sort of model could also be helpful if the financial pieces are what's really keeping people from being able to do the ministry that they feel like they're called to do. So Adam, I appreciate your question about how to get more involvement. So I think that's actually my last slide. How are you identifying leaders within the presbytery? Folks often talk about somebody tapping them on the shoulder and asking them whether they've considered some sort of leadership within the church setting as being one of the most important things that happened for them to begin to feel that tug to leadership in some way. And so, are we keeping our eyes open for people who have those gifts, whatever those gifts might be that we feel are needed in the church setting? And then are we actually then tapping them on the shoulder and having that conversation of like, hey, have you ever considered, because I see these gifts in you. One of the things that I also experienced in doing the Savannah School of the Laity, when I was reading the assignments, there were 3 people out of a class of like 12 in particular that I thought, gosh, these people are not actually in the commission pastor or commission ruling elder track for this presbytery, but gosh, if they were ever felt called to it, they'd be great. And so I passed that information on to the presbytery also. And then they asked whether I would feel comfortable actually sharing that with the students themselves. And so I did. And some of them were brand new Presbyterians, like 2 years into being in a Presbyterian church, but really understood the polity, really understood the history, the mission and ministry focus of the church, and some really deep ways that they appreciated, especially because some of them are coming from other denominations and saw what a huge difference being Presbyterian meant for them in their life of discipleship. And so, I don't think any of them actually one person eventually, like months later, also said they started feeling that call to become a commissioned pastor. The other 2, may not ever, but having that sort of tap on the shoulder to say, hey, have you ever considered this, that God may be calling you to some sort of leadership that's beyond what you're doing right now. So I wonder about what are the mechanisms in your presbyteries where you would have engagements that could help you identify those leaders and the gifts that people might actually be bringing. First, I love that they drew straws. It's like the lots and becoming the elder of the year. And maybe that biblical story can be trotted out and you draw lots, right? And I think the other piece that we sometimes I think we don't always emphasize or do as well in is just reminding folks that leadership is also something we grow into. It's not always that we're born into it. And so, it may be that those opportunities of, being chosen as the elder of the year is an opportunity for that person to actually step into a role, grow into it, and gain some confidence and really be able to flourish in that. And so again, what are those mechanisms that are there for the presbytery to be able to identify folks? I think I would wonder about that as part of this conversation about identifying congregational leaders. Because the other thing that I think we keep talking about is that there is more and more, I think Tim has this data from the undercare sort of preparation for ministry side, that more and more of our people who are under care are coming from suburban, mid to large size congregations who are going, into under care for ordained ministry. And so there can actually be these cultural mismatches in certain places. And so there are some who will then be able to actually overcome those cultural differences and be able to serve in different settings and feel called to those settings. But it also may be really important to continue to look for those gifts of spiritual leadership and congregational leadership within the places where the churches are. as well. Any other questions or comments that folks have? Well, thank you all for this active engagement on the chat and the good questions. I think I'm right around time.
Thank you, Jihyun. I am wondering, and this is, I mean, partly I'm wondering because the chat did not reveal a lot of ecumenical stuff, and I'm still new to the region. I am wondering, Mike Givler, if you are equipped with Zoom to set up a very fast poll where we could see a response of how many folks in your presbyteries is the typical rural community one where ecumenical engagement is actually even viable, or whether the typical rural community in your presbytery is one that basically the Presbyterian Church maybe is the only Protestant game in town. Do you have that readily at hand, or is that something that we would have needed to do in advance of the meeting?
So I think I can create it. I have a poll up here. So what would the question be?
Does the typical rural community have a viable ecumenical blah?
Or I think what I'm kind of hearing in your question is, does the typical rural community have potential ecumenical partners?
Yeah, why don't we phrase it that way? That works. Yeah.
Does the typical rural community have a viable ecumenical partners? Is that what I heard?
A potential ecumenical partners.
Mm-hmm.
Drop viable. Yeah.
Does the typical rural community have potential ecumenical partners? So we're looking at yes or no, I guess.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, let's just keep it real simple as far as the answer is concerned. I just love to kind of see what the hit rate on that is. And while people are voting, Jihyun, if you have sort of a perspective from conversations around the country as far as that's concerned, you know, are there places where ecumenical options sort of are much more likely, and places where they aren't? Have you noticed anything?
Yeah, so first, it's interesting because, and Rhonda knows this because we had some conversation with her. In late 2019, we started having this conversation about doing a formula of agreement sort of event. And where we landed was in Pennsylvania, actually, because that's where formula of agreement, all four formula of agreement partners had significant presence, both of congregations and ministers, for us to be able to do can we begin to build some relationships and get to know one another, especially among mid-council leaders or middle governing body leaders, so that when these sorts of exchange of minister situations happened, or accountability issues happened, or potentials for shared ministry would come up, that folks would actually know who to call. So we had sort of talked about that sort of event, but it was scheduled for the fall of 2020. And so for very obvious reasons, we never got to do it.
Yeah.
But I think there's been at least some conversation about what would it look like to do something like that, and sort of go back to doing something like that. So I think in Pennsylvania, I think that is sort of all four bodies I think are present in good numbers. I think in I know there are parts of Ohio where because I guess the UCCs are sort of headquartered there. There's some good numbers there. So it sort of depends on, I think, how those full communion partners, those ecumenical partnerships, sort of at least the full communion partnerships, I guess we can say, depending on how they sort of started and what regions, what sort of ethnic groups sort of primarily sort of started some of those denominations. They are in different parts of the country, and then those are the relationships that they build more often than not. I think where you were before in Southern California, I think, like, I know San Joaquin had some, I think, good ecumenical partnerships there. At least Les Heider sort of talked about some of those partnerships that they had for some congregations there. And then there are just other places where I think the mountain regions where even Presbyterian churches are not close to one another. I think those are probably places where it's not likely that they're happening just because population density.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, do we have a result?
Yeah, I have 85% say yes. That's 29 out of 34. 5 are no. 5 out of 34.
Okay, that's noteworthy then. So that's a sign that it is an option that could be exercised if it feels right for the church or the presbytery. Yeah, thank you.
The thing that I do want to, I guess one of the things that I realized I didn't say, or two things I didn't say is one, even though the commission for moderating session and the commission ruling elder pieces are usually presbytery to presbytery, you know, there may be times where talking to the neighboring presbytery, especially if there's a congregation that's near the border of the presbytery, being able to work out some of those partnerships might be really helpful if there is a church that's geographically a little bit further afield than others, and to see what sort of partnerships you might be able to enter into with your neighboring presbytery. And then I think the sort of new thing that might give rise to some different ways of thinking about alternative congregational leadership is the shared ministry grant that the Board of Pensions is rolling out with the 2025 Change in Benefits program. And so they're not requiring the yoking, which is a little bit more of that sort of shared decision making and those sorts of things that that can sort of go along with the yoking conversation. But it is for churches who say, yeah, we'd like to actually sort of look for a pastor together and then be able to get the benefit of getting the shared ministry grant that gives the Board of Pensions will actually offset up to 50% or 50% up to $10,000 a year for the pastor's benefit and pensions. So that may encourage some partnerships and congregations, even among PCUSA churches, that may have been less willing to sort of consider that partnership before.
Right, yeah, that is good news.
Yeah.
Any last questions or observations for Jihyun before we say thank you and take a break? Looks like there's one more in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah. Rhonda, yes, I think that's true that many of the mid-councils are actually concerned about merging themselves and not just the congregations. It's great to see all these examples of ecumenical outreach and partnership. So thank you all for sharing that. It's good to hear about those.
Well, Jihyun, thank you for the scope of your presentation and for the clarity, kind of piece by piece. I mean, I feel like I could make a matrix out of what you've presented to us in terms of options. So thanks for taking the time. We will look forward to, are you going to stay on for Tim's talk, or do we need to say goodbye and thanks now?
I think actually I need to sign off because I need to get onto one more meeting before I head to the airport again.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time this morning, and at least some of us will look forward to seeing you in Philadelphia next week.
Oh, I won't get to
No.
the Philadelphia one.
Okay,
So,
you've already
yeah.
been to Denver.
Yeah,
Fair
I've already been
enough.
to Denver. So yeah. So it was good
Okay.
being with you all. Thank
Be
you.
well, take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
For the rest of us, let's reconvene at 10:45 with Tim. Go ahead and take a minute or two. So that was the voice of Zoom that I was expecting to hear. Thanks, Mike. As I mentioned at the beginning of the day, Tim Cargal is the Associate Director for Ministry Leadership Development. I was going to say Ministry Preparation Development. I'm still getting used to your new title, but I'm sure that it means that you're getting used to all the extra work that involves. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being available and willing both to give us some news that we haven't heard before, and also interpret for us some news that we've probably heard a lot of in the last year. So we will look forward to what you have to say. Feel free to take the reins.
Thank you, Forrest. It is good to be with everyone this morning. And as Forrest mentioned, I want to kind of share with you some new resources and kind of update you on some things that are happening in the area of ministry preparation, specifically with ministers of Word and Sacrament. But in following on from our conversation already this morning with Jihyun, part of my responsibilities are also in the area of working with presbyteries as they think about alternative forms of pastoral leadership and developing those forms of leaders. So if you have questions around that, glad to continue those conversations. And as we begin, I'm going to pick up on kind of the last comment that showed up in chat. I don't think it got referenced before we took our break, but a question that was raised about how are the seminaries what are they doing to help students kind of expand their thinking and toward serving in multiple parish, multiple congregation settings and those kind of things. I think one of the things that is important for presbyteries as they're working with inquirers and candidates, and we'll talk about some resources that are available to help you with this, but if you've been in ministry for 2 decades or more, which is less time than I've been in ministry. I've been in ministry for over 35 years now. You just need to understand that the landscape has changed in very, very many ways. We've talked about some of the ways this morning how the landscape has changed with congregations, but it's changed in seminaries and in theological education as well. And it's changed in the preparation for ministry process. So one of the things to know is that some seminaries are very much akin to or aligned with and leaning into these questions about the changing context of ministry. Many of their students in some seminaries now are attending remotely rather than in person because they're staying engaged with congregations, they're staying engaged in local communities. But there's also a trend within seminaries where the seminaries, and this is a trend that's been noted by the Association of Theological Schools, the accrediting body as well, where many of the seminaries are becoming less professional schools, which has been their traditional role, preparing people for vocational service to the church, and becoming much more like their divinity school colleagues. And myself having been to both a seminary for my master's level education and then doing my PhD work in the context of a university divinity school and its graduate department of religion, there's some differences. And the more divinity school model is really focused on the disciplines of theological education and less about their application to the practice of ministry. And so there are in some of our seminaries now a minority of the faculty who would have ever been involved in pastoral ministry. Their training has been in the university system in their field of study, and there are great benefits to that, but there can also be some liabilities. So one of the things that you will need to explore with your inquirers and candidates is what's happening in the seminary where they are attending. Is it a seminary that is really helping them to kind of focus on the academic aspects of the preparation? But what are they doing to help them to explore the practice of ministry? What kind of opportunities are they promoting? Are your candidates getting exposure in congregational settings that are different than the congregations from which they originally came? Jihyun alluded to the fact that our candidates for ministry are very much like average Presbyterians. Whereas 60%, a little over 60% of our congregations have fewer than 100 members, only about 17% of PCUSA members attend a church that has fewer than that. So it's, there's just a kind of mismatch between where our candidates for ministry are coming from and the range of opportunities that are available for them in pastoral service and in other forms of ministry. And so one of the things that we do have to be much more intentional about is helping them to both imagine what it would be like to serve in a congregation, maybe not like the one that they're coming from that has a head of staff and one or two associates, but that would be more like the numerical majority of our churches that are served by one pastor or are served by one pastor serving multiple congregations. So this is just part of the changing landscape of ministry that it will be important for you as you're working with your inquirers and candidates to think about. So with that kind of as a bridge in, what I want to start by sharing with you this morning are some new tools. I'm going to do this by sharing my screen that we're making available to help presbyteries in their work with the inquirers and candidates that we think will be of use to you. They are available on the denomination's Equip website. We've already referenced this once this morning, and in fact, I'm going to show you another way to get to that course that Jihyun mentioned about ministers of other denominations than the direct link that I sent this morning. But the Equip website has a lot of resources that are available for a lot of different aspects of the church. I do want to identify that we are dealing with an issue at the moment. We had somebody who was using our site as a way to create phantom accounts. And so we've not really hacked, but kind of using it to create phantom accounts. And so we were having some issues, and we're working on some security updates to the site. So right now, if you don't already have an account on Equip, you will need to reach out to me directly. We hope to have that resolved in the next week or so. But if you have an account on Equip, for example, if you wanted to get to the resource that was mentioned this morning, you could come down to these limited enrollment offerings to mid-council leaders resources. And when you click there, you'll find the ministers of other churches resource that we've already talked about this morning. If you're not already enrolled in that course, you can simply click to enroll me, and then you'll see here, these are the range of resources that are there to help you with that. But with specific regard to preparation for ministry, there are two things that I want to direct your attention to that we have launched within the last 12 months or so. The first of which is in an area called seminarian resources. And in the seminarian resources, there are two things. One is ordination preparation resources. These have actually been around for 8 or 9 years now. So they've been around for a good period of time. But in the last year, we've added this Seminarian's Guide to Entering PCUSA Ministry. This resource talks about the overall kind of structure of the preparation for ministry process. It has a mix of videos and texts. It talks about other resources that are available, including the handbook on the whole process. It has some introductory pieces, not the full preparation pieces, about the ordination exams, what their role is, and some kind of overviews about them. And then also it provides a kind of advanced look at the far horizon of the preparation process about what it means once a person has been certified ready to seek a call, about how they would become and look for that first call, including some resources about how to help them understand church leadership connection and its use. So this resource can be very good as a place to point those who are contacting your presbytery about entering into the process of discernment. It can also be a really helpful tool, particularly on the section dealing with the preparation process, as you are orienting sessions to their responsibilities toward inquirers and candidates. So to help everybody kind of understand what the principles of our process are, how it typically unfolds, so it can be a really helpful tool for you in that. It's also a great place to start in kind of orienting your new CPM members to kind of get them an overview of what's going on. But for your CPM members, I want to direct your attention to a resource that's actually in the section Presbytery Committee Resources. And at the top of the list, you'll see one that's called Preparation for Ministry Oversight. Again, this is one that once you're there, you can enroll, anyone can enroll themselves there as long as they have an account on Equip. And it's basically what we have done here is occasionally I am invited to do CPM training, not in an hour and 10-15 minute conversation over Zoom, but in a day and a half or 2-day conference. And so what we've tried to do is to take what we cover when we get that kind of time, that's usually with a cluster of presbyteries or a synod, but when we get that, 8 to 10 hours of, as continuing education professionals will refer to it, contact hours, actual face-to-face time, what would we cover? And we've tried to make that available then in an online format. And so in this section, we have materials about the theology and culture of ministry today that look at what the preparation framework is. This video, in fact, is the same one that's used in the Seminarian's Guide. So there's some overlap there. Another video that's about the journey into ministry. There's some text bases training here that are key concepts for the process. And then just looking at preparing for 21st century ministry. What are the trends that we're seeing both among our inquirers and candidates and across the church that people need to be aware of? We have then a section that's specifically on the constitutional process. One of the things that we stress in these day-long trainings is that our process of preparation is designed to be highly individualized. It really focuses on a handful, and by that I mean literally a handful, 5 outcomes of preparation, and gives you a lot of flexibility about how you meet some of those outcomes. And so we stress that in this more comprehensive training, that part of the responsibility of a CPM then is to understand those constitutional requirements and the outcomes that they're looking for so well that they can individualize a process that would bring a person to those outcomes. So this section deals with what are those constitutional processes? What is the purpose of the inquiry phase? What's different about being an inquirer or candidate? How do we conclude the process through final assessment? And then what are the responsibilities that we have to those who are candidates who are certified, ready to be examined during the time that they're searching? Excuse me. Searching for that first call. The next, excuse me. All right. The next section, the roles and responsibilities. So what are the roles? Who are the players here? There's the presbytery through the CPM. There's the applicant. There's also the session. What are the responsibilities of each of these partners in the process? And what should they be doing? What are the administrative responsibilities that a CPM has to the broader church in terms of reporting about inquirers and candidates and so forth? their role in electing ordination exam readers, and we'll talk more about ordination exams in a moment. So that's this section that deals in with what are these different responsibilities. Documenting the process. What's the documentation you need to be keeping? How do you need to be keeping that documentation? How long do you need to be keeping that documentation? We talk about in this training the twin sisters that you really must know, which are due diligence and negligent supervision. What is required to exercise your due diligence in this oversight role? How do you need to document it so that you can show that you did that? And then negligent supervision then has to do with what do you do with that information that you gained through that due diligence process. So that's all covered in here, along with some example forms and so forth that you can use for that. There's a section on discernment and decision making, so that we really locate the preparation for ministry process as a period and an exercise in joint discernment about a person's gifts for ministry and their how far they have developed those gifts and whether they're then ready to move into a call that would require ordination, so that we can really move it away from this idea that there's just these hoops or boxes, hoops I have to jump through or boxes that I have to check, that people can understand, well, what's behind these different requirements? What is it we're trying to discern? What is it in the language of the Book of Order that we're looking for evidence of through this particular process? So that's covered in that section just on ordination exams, particularly the role of CPMs relative to ordination exams. So to help you to why we have the exams, what the evaluation standards are. It's really important for CPMs to understand that. We just had, just in the last week, we've had 2 cases where presbyteries have decided that they wanted to appeal exam evaluations, which is a possibility. But if you're going to appeal it, you have to be able to give arguments for why the readers misapplied the standards of evaluation. And if you don't know what the standards of evaluation are, it's going to be a little difficult to write an appeal. And so in one case, we frankly just had to send it back because they said, well, we disagree with the readers. And we had to say, okay, great. That tells us why you want to appeal, but that's not an appeal. You've got to show us where the evaluation standards you think were misapplied to the response that was given. So areas there. Some discussion about alternative assessment. So when the ordination exams are not an appropriate way to assess a particular candidate, how do you make that determination? And then what's the process that's provided under the Constitution for using an alternative means of assessment? So again, all of those things are covered in there. And then the last piece of it are some Bible studies that you can do online or that you could use as part of the devotional period with your CPM. But the 2 series, one of them is based on the characteristics indicating readiness for ministry. These are based on what is found in G 2.0607A, about that at final assessment, a candidate is supposed to bring evidence of possessing wisdom and maturity of faith, leadership skills, compassionate spirit, honest repute, and sound judgment. And so these are Bible studies. They take about 7 minutes to watch, and there's some discussion tips and things in them that you could do with your CPM to help them to understand the biblical basis and the theological basis for why these are the outcomes that we're looking for in our candidates. The other Bible study series that we have is on the purposes for which we prepare, and this arises out of the great ends of the church. So if a person who is entering into ministry is going to be involved in helping the church to develop its broader gifts and to engage in the purposes of the church, the great ends of the church, how then does that relate back then to what skills, what gifts, what preparation someone would need to be a minister to help the church achieve these ends. So a couple of different Bible study sequences. Now, one of the things that you may have noticed is there are these little seals on each of these sections, which are, if you've been involved in distance education, online education, you may have run into these ideas of badges. And so your CPM members, as they complete each of these sections, they can earn a badge. And if they earn the badges for all the sections, they get a separate badge showing that they've completed the full cycle of training. So I'm going to go back to the home page, the first page of this course really quickly. And so the very first thing here is called an overview of this training. It's a page that they can read. This is the badge for what the badge looks like if you complete everything. And if my demo account here, Just Demo, had actually taken the time to read all of that, and then had finished it, then when they would go back, they would now see they've got a green little check mark here that they finished the first part of their required training. And so they can track their progress through as they're completing each section. It will even tell them which sections, if they hover over it, that they've not yet done. So we've got several dozens. I think when I looked this morning, there's something like, well, let's see, we can get the count from the users page. I know I can for mine. Yeah, so we've got about 73 people already who have started this training. When I was looking this morning, I saw that one of them has exactly one piece left to actually earn the badge for completion of all of the training. So we're about to award our first badge for total completion of everything in it. And this has only been available since the middle of January, for about 3 months now. So again, this can be a really useful tool both for kind of comprehensive training, but it's also a good tool if you've got a specific issue that you're dealing with in your CPM. You can come here and you can find some guidance and training on that specific issue. So again, let's say you're considering whether or not to give an alternative means of assessment to a candidate. So one thing you could do then is to have your members go to the section that's on the ordination exams, go to the alternative assessment of competency, and watch that video. And it would walk them through the questions that are that you ask when you're considering it. It even talks about what's necessary to be in the motion to the presbytery to ask the presbytery to approve the alternate means. So you can kind of dip in and out of this resource at different times to provide just specific training on specific topics of things that are before you at the moment. So let me kind of pause there for a moment, see if you all have any questions about this resource. Okay. I'm not seeing anything here, though I'll be honest, I've lost the chat window, so I'm not sure. Let me see if I can get that back while you all are. Yes, go ahead.
Tim, this is Todd Wright with the CPM at Presbytery, West Virginia. We've got a case where a member of our presbytery is wanting to become a commissioned pastor and grew up in the Catholic Church. And so even though he's been through the preparation process to become a commissioned pastor, you know, it's hard for him to shake the theology that he was brought up in. We're asking that he would take a class in Reformed theology. Are there units in this piece that you've just been talking about that would help him get a better grasp of Reformed theology on sacraments and things like that?
So this training is, the CPM training is really about the CPM process. So the place that you might think that you might see that would be, for example, in the preparation resources for seminarians on preparing to take the ordination exams. So perhaps there would be information that would be there. in the section on the theological competence exam, right? This resource is prepared by the PCC, and one of the things that they do is to really focus on the structure of the exams and the standards of evaluation, what the purpose of the theology exam is. It doesn't try to provide training on Reformed theology itself. The reason they don't is they don't want to set an expectation for candidates that if it didn't come up in this overview training, it won't come up in an exam. So they also don't recommend specific books that could be read or so forth. So these materials really are serving a different purpose than that. I would say if you're looking for something like that, I can tell you that one of the standard textbooks in that's used by a number of seminaries on their basic course, kind of introductory course in Reformed theology, is by Daniel Migliore. I'll spell that last name in the chat. Well, actually, I'll put the first name in there too. But Daniel Migliore. His book is called Faith Seeking Understanding. I think it's in his 4th or 5th edition now. For those of you who don't recognize that quote from Anselm, that's the title of the book, Faith Seeking Understanding. And it provides a really good kind of summary of Reformed theology. And so if you're looking for something that you might have an individual like you're describing read, that would be one that I would recommend. One of the other possibilities, and this would go far beyond what we typically recommend for, or most presbyteries require for someone to be commissioned to limited pastoral service. But there are, as I mentioned, there are a lot of seminaries now that are beginning to provide online offerings. One of the leaders of this early on was the University of Dubuque, who was actually kind of moving in this direction. Prior to the pandemic, there's been others who had to make a lot of shift to distance education during the pandemic that are trying to kind of keep that going. But the University of Dubuque Theological Seminary has a number of courses that are designed to be just done completely remotely. And so you might look at having them take just that one course through UDTS. So that would be a couple of options that I could suggest for you in a case like that.
Tim, 2 things. I don't see the name in the chat. Maybe you sent it to someone individually, but it's not, I don't see the name of that author.
Okay,
I'm
sorry, I had not switched it over.
And there's a question about how do you join Equip?
Right. So as I said, at the moment, what you would need to do is to send an email to me, and then I will create a basic system for you. Normally, there's a way to just simply on the login page say, I'm a new user, please create an account for me. Right now, that's because we've had the security issue, that's not available. I pointed out on the home page right now, there's a note about that inavailability that's here. So if you go to Equip and you don't see that notice, you'll know that you'll be able to use the login block, which is normally going to be over here, to create a new account. But in the meantime, as long as you see that, just send an email to me. So I'll put my email in the chat. And to type and talk at the same time is more coordination than I can muster. So Tim Cargal at tim.cargal@pcusa.org, and I will set up a base account so that people can get started. Many people already have accounts because we have resources on this site for just some of the other things, but for ruling elders, and Theology and Formation Office of the Church has some resources here about discipleship and the 8 habits of evangelism. So there's a lot of resources that are on the site. But if you don't, and by the way, all of your inquirers and candidates have accounts to this site. When you report them as an inquirer or candidate, where they actually get the, I can move this down so I can get in here and open another tab. They get an account at exams.pcusa.org, where many people are busy this morning taking exams. And so when they log into their account, so we'll get my demonstration account going here. So when they're logged in at exams, which is where they'll go to register to take exams and all of that, they'll see access Moodle site. And if they click that link, then they already have the account. So they won't even need to contact us. So any of your inquirers or candidates, they already have direct access through their exams account for registration to these courses for seminarians, including the ordination preparation resources. Okay.
Question of if you have any idea when that issue
Right.
will be fixed with.
We're working on it. We hope to have it resolved by the end of this week, but you know, we're aware that it's a major problem, and so we're trying to get it resolved. One of the reasons we just had to take this step of just making it unavailable while we work out some of the issues was the particular people who were going in and creating these accounts and then using them to send out spam. We were about to lose our ability to send any email from our automated systems. And you can imagine in a period running up to the General Assembly, we couldn't lose that ability to send emails to commissioners and everybody else. So we had to take the step that we really didn't want to take, and we're working to get it resolved as quickly as we can. Okay. Other questions about that? Or the site? Okay. Then I'm going to stop sharing screens, and I have not prepared a PowerPoint for this because I want to kind of update you on some things that are going on with the ordination exams. Many of you will be aware that there's been a lot of discussion about the ordination exams over the last year, arising from some concerns about the subject of the Bible exegesis exam last winter, so a little over a year ago now. The Presbytery's Cooperative Committee on Examinations for Candidates, which is the body established by the Book of Order to develop and administer the standard ordination exams for the church, has been engaged since the concerns were raised about that specific test with a number of partners across the church, mid-council leaders, various of the advocacy committees of the church, the Committee on Theological Education, around the concerns that were raised, and looking at things that should be done with the ordination exams. And so one of the things that they clarified immediately was that there is, because these are standard exams, they're administered online, there are some procedures that have to do with maintaining the security for the exams. And so when students log in, as they did this morning, to start taking tests, one of the things that they say is, I will not discuss the contents of these exam questions during the period that testing is progressing. Obviously, the purpose of that is, since candidates now can choose what order they take the exams within the testing period. So we have some people who chose this morning to start with a polity exam. We have some people who chose this morning to start with a theology exam. We have some people who chose to start this morning with a worship exam. What the PCC does not want is for three friends to get together and say, okay, well, I'll take the polity exam today, you take the theology exam today, you take the worship exam today. And at the end of the day, we'll get together and we'll talk about what the questions are so you can prepare before you open the exam that you're going to take next. Obviously, that would be a problem. And so the question about not disclosing the content of exam questions or so forth is a part of the security statements. They're told not to post about the contents of the questions on social media or through other means and so forth. And some candidates had understood that to mean that if taking the exams had activated something in them and they felt like they needed to get some pastoral care, that they were prohibited by the exam process and exam procedures from contacting anyone about that issue during the testing period. That was never the intent, and it was never actually even covered by the the statement. It was a conclusion that was being drawn, and so the PCC has clarified, and now has even clarified in the online statement itself that comes up at the beginning of the exam, that again, should an exam question or something that arises in one of the scenarios activate something for them, and they feel that they need to reach out to get pastoral care or support, they are free to do that. They can't ask for somebody to help them figure out how to respond to the subject of the question, but they are certainly free during the exam window to discuss about, things that may have been activated for them from their past. So the PCC has been working to kind of clarify some of the issues around the exams. The PCC is also in the process now of doing a review of the structure of the exams. The structure of the exams really have not changed. The most recent structural changes were to the exegesis exam, and those came into place. The current structure of that exam was approved by the PCC in 2009, 2008, somewhere in that period. So there really haven't been any changes to the structure of the exam in at least 15 years. And the structure of the polity exam, worship and sacraments exam, theology exams really haven't been changed in probably 25 or 30 years. When those exams were first designed, and the exams are not, exam structures are not written on stone, they do change from time to time. Some of you may have been in ministry long enough to remember that the polity exam used to have a multiple choice section at the very beginning. It wasn't just essays. It also had a multiple choice section, kind of like the Bible content exam, about some kind of basic questions about church polity. That was removed after a few years. But so the exam structure does change. But one of the things the PCC is looking at right now is that the basic structure of the ordination exams really follows the structure of seminary curricula from the 1980s and 1990s, when the exams beginning in the 1970s, and the structure of the seminary education was really pretty much the same in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where a 3-year Master of Divinity program began with the first year was kind of the foundations and the history of the different disciplines of theological education, so historical theology, courses in Bible that were firmly rooted in kind of the historical critical method. And then in the second year of seminary, you moved to more constructive questions. So in terms of Bible, you moved into questions like of exegesis and interpretation. In theology, you moved on to kind of systematics or dogmatic theology. So, how do we draw on the scriptural and the theological tradition to answer contemporary questions in the life of faith and discipleship? And then the third year of seminary was really focused on praxis and practice. And the structure of the exams, if you go back and look at them, all 4 of those senior ordination exams have exactly that structure. The first question is an historical question. So if it's a polity exam, what's the history of our polity? What are the historical foundations of our polity? The second question is a construction question. So the actual name of that section in the theology exam is Constructive Statement of Theological Doctrine. So you're going to construct a theological statement in that. And in terms of the history, both the worship and theology exams start with what the Book of Confessions is, the kind of historical basis of our theology. And then the last section is the application to ministry. So this praxis question. And so while that structure kind of made immediate sense to you when you opened an exam book in the 1990s, back when I took the tests, because your whole theological education had been structured that way. For me, I did my theological education in seminary in the 80s, but because I was in PhD work, didn't do the ordination exams until some years later. But you just kind of intuitively understood the unfolding of the exam because it was the way your whole theological education had been structured. That's not the structure of most seminary curriculum today. And so the PCC is looking at ways that it could adjust and restructure the exams so that it reflects more the way that theological education is done now, and would then be more intuitive, if you will. The progression through the exam would be more intuitive to candidates. So they are in the process of that. They began that review last year. One of the things to understand about the work of the PCC is that the development of an exam is about a 3-year process. So in the first year, they decide on the topic of a question. Once they've set that, okay, for an exam coming up 3 years from now, the section 1 topic is going to be on this, and the section 2 topic is going to be on that, and the section 3 topic is going to be on something else. Then they spend time over the course of the year developing the scenario that will give rise to that raises that topic. And they write out those scenarios. The 4 senior exams all have a kind of case study model to them. So you're presented with something and then asked to write a ministry work product. So they work out the details of that case study. The case studies are always constructed. They're never direct case studies that come out of the life of the church, but they're always informed by things that the members of the church, through their own experience in the church and their practice of ministry, are aware are ongoing and real concerns that come up in the life of congregations and ministry. But they will fabricate a scenario around those issues. And at the end of that middle term, they will present then that initial draft to members of this committee beyond their task group. So that if the polity exam team has been working on the set of scenarios for the 9 scenarios that would be covered by the 3 exams in a certain year, they present those to their colleagues, and their colleagues kind of say, okay, well, if I were taking this test, this is how I would respond. And so that they can get feedback of, okay, are there things here that are just going to lead people astray? Are they focused? Is the question clear about what its expectations are? So that's what happens in the 2nd year of development. In the 3rd year of development, they bring back revisions to those questions, and the whole PCC has to agree on every word. So they will hash out, is that clear? Do we need to change the phrasing on that, and so forth? They settle on the exact wording of the test, and then the resources are developed for the readers to help them to apply the evaluation standards to those questions. So it's a 3-year process to develop an exam. And so as the PCC is now looking at kind of restructuring the exams, they anticipate that they may have some new models for exams that would be presented to the full committee for approval at their next meeting in March of next year, after they had done some preliminary work on it this year. But with that being the case, even if they approve a new structure, it will still be 2 or 3 years before the first exam with that structure would actually come out. And they will use that time then to be sure that they update all the materials for preparation, all the guidance that is given to readers. Everything will be updated as well, so that people know that when the first exam in, say, the fall of 2027 or 2028, first exam that would have that new structure, people would know well in advance what the structure would be and how it would change. You may be aware that there is an overture coming before the assembly. It is now designated as Ordination 6. So ORD-06. If you go to PC Biz, I'll put that in. So PCBiz.org is the website. And then the overture is ORD-06. It's received concurrences from think when I looked yesterday, 4 or 5 presbyteries, but is asking for a review of the preparation for ministry process and specifically the role of the exams in the process, raises a number of questions that they would like considered about the exams. So we will see, it's calling actually for a special committee to do this. I've been in various roles with the Office of the General Assembly since 2009 in supporting the preparation for ministry process with the presbyteries during that period. This would be the second special committee that was created if the Assembly goes through with this. If they approve the creation of special committee, this would be the second one during my tenure where the General Assembly has created a special committee to look at the process, look at the role of the exams in the process. This last happened in 2012, and the report then was given back to the General Assembly in 2014. There were some changes that were made to the exams at that time arising out of that. Though the Assembly and both the special committee and the Assembly kept the basic structure and the purpose of the exams, did not make any changes to the structure of the PCC, made a few tweaks to the overall preparation for ministry process. Again, nothing major, just some more clarifications than anything else. So this is something that the commissioners this summer will be looking at and making recommendation to the Assembly that will then decide whether to have another review, again, about a decade on, and if so, how that would be done. So with that as a kind of catching up on what's going on in the world of exams, let me see if you have questions about either those specific things or other questions about the ordination exams in the preparation for ministry process. Either in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask a question. Doesn't sound like you're going to be talking over each other too much.
Hi, this is Blanche. I did want to get registered for Equip, but I didn't get your entire email address.
Sure.
So
I'll put that back in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
There it is. When was the last time the denomination considered the necessity of studying Hebrew and Greek? So the last time that would have been considered would have been, well, in two places. The most formal review of it would have been part of the revision of the entire form of government that happened between 2007 and 2009, and then was approved by the presbyteries in 2011. If you have been doing this as long as I have, you'd be aware that in 2005, there were 14 pages in the Book of Order about the preparation for ministry process. And it was highly detailed. I mean, including such things as during the second annual consultation, you will ask the following questions. So it was highly specific. Through the form of government revision process, we ended up with what are essentially the 2 pages that we have now, which really focus much more on outcomes rather than procedures. There have been, I think, amendments to 2 or 3 paragraphs since 2011. Again, mainly clarification, some coming out of the special review. So the one opportunity where the church looked very systematically between 2005 and 2009 at the whole section of preparation for ministry was during those form of government revisions, and the requirement was retained at that point. It was also a thing that was looked at by the special committee that was created in 2012, and they also decided to retain the requirement. So generally, part of the question might be then, so why do you think we've kept it? The answer that I normally give, and I can't say that this was, I can point to places in the minutes of those review committees and rewrite committees where they said exactly this. But if I had to explain why we still think it's important, is that when my children were going through high school, they're both grown now, and I'm a grandparent and all of that kind of stuff. But when they were going through high school and they were taking language classes and literature classes and so forth, I would have been quite disappointed if my daughter, who took a course in Spanish humanities, and so was looking at the artistic tradition of Spain, its literary tradition, et cetera, if the teacher who was teaching that course on the humanities at a high school level, focused on Spanish culture, had not had an ability to read Spanish or speak Spanish, I would really question, the depth in which they could really talk about the place of Don Quixote in the development of Spanish culture and literature if they didn't speak any Spanish at all, even as a high school level. And I think essentially what we have said historically is that the scriptures are so fundamental to our faith and our understanding and our theology and our communal life together. And yet they weren't given to us in English. And so it is important that our ministers of Word and Sacrament have the ability to engage these texts in the language and the culture in which they were given to us. There certainly are arguments to be had on all sides around that, but I would argue that probably is why we've done it. Will another committee look at that and change it? We'll see what happens there. Jerry Lynn.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned that I'm seeing like a total disconnect in the PCUSA with respect just to what I've been hearing this morning. So on the one hand, we're saying anybody, no qualifications whatsoever, can preach from our pulpits God's word, which forms the faith of our people. And then on the other hand, we talk about the importance, and it seems like that's our foundational theology of our ministers being trained and how important that is. So I'm concerned about this diversion in the two ways our national denomination is going, and how are we going to bring that together?
Yeah, this is a diversion that's been part of the Presbyterian tradition in the United States since before there was a United States. About what is the amount of training that is necessary to engage in pastoral ministry and the ministry of Word and Sacrament with our congregations. In your section of the world, you may never have even encountered them, but I was ordained in Tennessee, and there are a lot of them, but some of you will have heard of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church exists because of this very debate in the period leading up to the Civil War, when we were, of course, having Western expansion across the continent, and there was this concern that if the Presbyterian Church was going to be able to keep pace with the Western expansion of European settlers, that we needed to be able to send ministers out. And it was concerned, well, we can't train them. And the Cumberland Presbyterian Church said, well, it's more important that we send them than that we train them. And they split and formed a different denomination. So this has been a question that's been with us for a very, very long time. The way that I think that I try to balance the two is that why do we have these high standards for ministers of Word and Sacrament? And I think one of the kind of keys to it is in the other term for people who are in that order of ministry, which is teaching elder. And that the one way to think about who it is that they're to teach, they certainly have a duty to teach the whole congregation and all of the faithful, but they have a specific responsibility to teach those who are in the other orders of ministry. So the ruling elders and the deacons. So we expect a higher level of training and preparation for those who are going to have the responsibility of teaching others to be in these other orders of ministry than we might expect of even them in those orders, right? Again, I expected my daughter's high school teachers to know more than what they were teaching to my high school student. I expected my doctoral professors, frankly, to know more than some of my undergraduate professors who weren't doctorate, right? Because they need to teach me at a higher level than what I was being trained for when I was still an undergraduate. And so this is also, I think, why, and Jihyun mentioned this in the section this morning, the Book of Order requires that if you have a ruling elder who's been commissioned to limited pastoral service in one of those three areas, the Book of Order requires that they have a minister of word and sacrament, a teaching elder mentor, who engages with them, who helps them in their work, who is supporting their continuing growth in their own preparation. And so one of the reasons we've maintained these higher standards for the minister of word and sacrament is precisely because of their responsibility to be the ones who are teaching those who are in the ordered ministries of ruling elder and deacon.
I'm not sure then we have been upholding that part of who we've been called to be.
It's
teaching elders.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I know I was in, before I was in this job, I had spent 2 decades, 20 years as a pastor or associate pastor while also being a professor, either in a seminary or university context. And I know that, you know, there were some years I did a lot better job of ruling elder training than I did other years. But it is one of the things that is very important to our understanding and why we can talk about an equality across the orders of ministry, that ministers of word and sacrament are not superior to ruling elders. They have different responsibilities and different authorities, but the maintenance of that really is founded on this idea that the ministers of word and sacrament have trained and developed beyond that level of just the general congregation, those who would be in the ordered ministries of deacon and ruling elder.
Then I think that model where the presbyteries have a teaching elders that sole responsibility is to equip and train churches without a teaching elder is kind of a good model moving forward.
It's one that I view much more hopefully than just, sure, we'll give you permission, check in with us every now and then.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions about the exams or those matters? All right. Well,
Tim,
we do have, yes,
Tim,
go ahead.
a moment or two ago, I saw Pat Schaefer with her hand up, and I wanted to just see if her question in her mind had been answered, or if the conversation had just moved on to a place where the question was no longer timely.
And we can certainly circle back.
Okay, thank you, Forrest. There are a number of seminaries that have opened. What do we do with inquirers / candidates who have gone or are going to a seminary that is not accredited by the PCUSA?
Well, the PCUSA doesn't accredit seminaries.
The list, on the list.
Right. Well, and again, the what list? We don't actually publish a list of acceptable presbyteries, right? So the language that's in the Book of Order is, this is G 2.0607C, is that they must attend a theological education institution that is accredited by the Association of Theological Schools.
Right.
So if it's not on the ATS list, then you just, I mean, well, but there's a couple of things there. One is if it's just some fly-by-night internet thing that's been thrown up on the internet in the last couple of years, you might say, no, sorry, non-starter, we're not going to accept that. One of the reasons why, now, there can be reasons why you might waive that requirement. And so in G 2.0610, which is about when do you grant waivers to these requirements? So why might you consider a school that was not accredited by the Association of Theological Schools? Well, I have to tell you, Oxford University and Cambridge University are not accredited by the Association of Theological Schools. The reason for that is because ATS accredits institutions in the United States and Canada. So if Oxford wanted to be accredited by the ATS, it couldn't because it's outside its jurisdiction. So there will be times when you will look at a school that's not ATS accredited and say, perhaps if someone who has studied overseas, maybe in Korea or England or wherever, and so the school is not ATS accredited, but you can look at the school, you can look at the what were the courses that they had to take, what get us some sample syllabi. We can say, yeah, this is equivalent to what would have been received had they gone to an ATS school, and you would still have to waive that specific requirement, even if they went to Oxford. And you would have to provide to the presbytery, when you ask the presbytery under the provisions of G 2.0610 to waive the ATS requirement, you would have to provide good and sufficient reasons for why that's the case. So you will need to investigate if the school is not ATS accredited, is it still a bona fide quality theological education or not? If it's not, then you simply say, you can just say to them, hey, we're not going to seek a waiver. You need to find a school that's ATS accredited.
Okay.
Now the next phrase is equally important, because the next phrase is accredited by the Association of Theological Schools and acceptable to the presbytery.
Okay.
So there are some ATS schools that may not be acceptable to your presbytery, even though they're ATS accredited. It could be that you look at their that seminary statement of faith and its structure of its faculty, and you find out that this is a school that, even though it's accredited by the ATS, is opposed to some fundamental principles that organize us. They're rabidly opposed to women in ministry. Let's take that as an example. There are no women on the faculty. And you could say, listen, ATS may have accredited them, but that theological perspective, if that's what you were trained in and that's what you're going to bring, we're not ready to approve that, right? So
Right.
it has to meet those two questions.
Okay.
It has to be ATS accredited. That's the first threshold. But even if it passes that threshold, the presbytery can still say, no, that's not acceptable to us. And you've got a kind of range of options when you do that. One, you could say, yeah, they're just so beyond the veil, we're not going to accept any of it. It could be that you would say, we've got some concerns, and so we would like you to take some courses, maybe from UTTS or some other distance education, specifically, for example, in Reformed theology. Maybe they went to, well, for example, just down the road from me here in Louisville is Ashland Theological Seminary. It's an ATS accredited Methodist seminary. So one of the questions you might have is, did you get any Reformed theology there? And so you could still say, as one of the outcomes of candidacy, that, okay, you studied theology, but it was all in the kind of Wesleyan tradition. You haven't had any exposure to Reformed theology. So we'll go ahead and not tell you you've got to repeat your seminary education on Moss,
Right.
but you do need to take a course in Reformed theology.
Okay.
Specifically Reformed theology. Now, the other thing that I would just advise you is that that's not going to be just a question with Ashland Theological Seminary. It's something you're going to have to increasingly watch for, even if they go to Princeton or to Louisville. So, you know, the historically Presbyterian seminaries who are either institutional members of the Committee on Theological Education or in covenant relationship with the church, to see, well, what courses did you take? Because as I alluded to earlier, talked about earlier, the theological structure of education has changed. And so decades ago, when I went through seminary, I went to a seminary with a Reformed heritage. And so I took a course on systematic theology over a course of a year, and it talked about the Wesleyan and so forth, but it was a Reformed rooted course, right? Well, in some seminaries now, you can get all the theology credits that you need and never take a kind of foundational course. So you might do all of your theology training, for example, in feminist and liberationist understandings of the atonement, or, you know, that'd be a great and fascinating course. But it may not give you the kind of foundations in Reformed theology. And so one of the things that you're just going to have to do more now is to not kind of rely on, oh, we know that school, but also find out what courses did you take? Who did you study with? Because not every theologian who teaches theology at a PCUSA affiliated seminary is a Reformed theologian.
Right.
You know, all of our seminaries have become ecumenical seminaries, and again, there's a lot of benefit that comes from that. But, you know, you're just going to have to do a little more homework now. Well, who were the theologians that you studied with? You know, who were your professors? What were you reading? And those kind of things, especially if it's not a PCUSA affiliated school. About 40% of our inquirers and candidates don't attend PCUSA affiliated schools. So especially with those, you want to look, but even with our PCUSA schools, you're going to have to kind of give a little more attention than you might have assumed in the past to precisely what courses did they take, who did they study with, what were the assigned readings, were they getting an exposure to Reformed theology specifically.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Other questions? Maureen.
Tim, just to follow that up a little bit, is it reasonable for a CPM to ask either the candidate inquirer or the seminary for syllabi for particular classes?
Yeah, certainly. And again, look, so when you get that syllabus, so what's the range of topics that are covered? What were the assigned readings? That's perfectly legitimate and appropriate. And again,
Thanks.
especially if it's, you know, if you're dealing with a seminary that you're not sure about and you're trying to make some determinations about, is this a seminary that's acceptable to the presbytery? Then that would give you some really important information that you could use to make that decision. Other questions? Or perhaps you have comments that you'd like to make either about the exams or other things about the preparation for ministry process that could be useful. I will be one of the resource persons for the Assembly Committee that is dealing with this overture. And as a resource person, I'm not trying to persuade them to do one thing or another, but just provide them with background information as they request it. So perhaps if you have things that you would like them to be aware of that I might be able to share with them, glad to hear that as well. How do you handle, in the chat, how do you handle CPM turnover where candidates feel like they've been held to varying standards? I think one of the things that is most important is that as you are setting the expectations, one of the documentation pieces that we talk about in that section of the training I overviewed this morning are these, when you have a consultation, then you write a statement of, okay, so what are the objectives between now and the next consultation? You actually write those out. So with regard to your supervised practice of ministry, these are things that we would like you to look at, to attend to. If there are courses that you want them to take. So for example, you have someone who at the end of their first year of seminary, they've had both their courses and a foundational course in Old Testament, foundational course in New Testament. They take the BCE. Maybe they don't score 70. Maybe they score above 70 and they satisfy the requirement, but in looking at the test, you see that they did pretty well on some things, but they just really didn't know anything about the prophets. They did really bad on the questions on the prophets, or they did really bad on the questions on the Pauline letters. So you might say, congratulations, you don't have to take the BCE again, but we do want you to take a course on the prophets, or we do want you to take a course on Paul's letters, or whatever it might be. Or you know, whatever has emerged, supervised practice of ministry. The report that we got back for the last semester that you did that said you were doing really well in these areas, but you weren't doing as well in these others. So this is how we want you to address those. Be sure those are written down, and that that the way that they are stated and phrased is signed off on by both the committee and the one who's under care, because that then can be kind of the place that you kind of go back to, and the candidate can reasonably say, you set out these expectations for me and I met them. And so if there is the sense that they're varying the standards, or to more colloquially, that they feel like they're moving the goalposts, that if that's the case, you should be able to say, yes, but here's the specific reason. This is the new thing that we've learned since you did that. There's another concern in the general area that has come up, either because of coursework or performance on a standard exam, or because of something that came out in a field education report. This is the reason why we want you to do this. We have learned something we didn't know before, and so now we're asking this of you. It could be something that has emerged in their own sense of call. So for example, you might have someone who comes under care initially, but along the way they decide, you know what, I really feel like my call will be more to like a chaplaincy setting than in a congregational setting. And so you may say, okay, we didn't realize that. That's when you started. We're all coming forward to this as one of the things that's emerging out of this process and your refinement of your sense of call. So if that's really what you think you're discerning now, we're going to require you to do CPE, clinical pastoral education, because that's going to be essential for you to both further discern whether that really is your call, and if it is, to help you develop skills that will be essential to that. So that could be a new requirement that you're putting in that arises out of what you've learned through the process. And that could, I think, deal with a lot of this. Now, the other place we're going to hear about varying standards is they're going to come back from seminary, and you're going to have certain things that you require for everybody. And they're going to come back from seminary and tell you about their friend from the seminary, from the presbytery, four presbyteries over, or in a synod in a different part of the country that doesn't require that. And so one of the things that feel free to kind of direct their attention back to, because in the training, both for the seminarians and the others, for CPMs, in that part about the process, is that there are 3 levels of things that we require. There are some things that we require of absolutely everybody, and those are in the Book of Order, and there are only 5 of them. There are things that a presbytery requires that everybody who's under their care, because that presbytery has found over time that information is vital to them in them making their determination about the person's readiness and call. And then there will be things that are required of you as an individual because they emerge out of our work with you. And all of those are equally important. And so the process isn't ever going to be exactly the same for anybody who goes through, because what we really are trying to do is discern with you your call, to discern your gifts and what development needs to still happen in those gifts before you're ready to assume the responsibilities of a minister of word and sacrament. I see that we're at the top of the hour, Forrest.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, judging by the interaction, this is the kind of thing that, yeah, we probably could spend 2 days talking about if we had the chance to get together. So thank you for the detail that you've gone into, at least with the hour and 15 minutes that we did give you. And thanks, folks, for an engaging conversation. I have found myself with even more comments and questions that I would love to make if we had another hour, but I'm going to refrain from that out of consideration for you all. So thanks, Tim. Thanks for showing up. Will you be at Philadelphia next week?
No, I will not be at Philadelphia next week. Next week, where will I be next week? Next week, I will be, well, the first part of the week, I will be in Pittsburgh with my family for the baby shower for my grandson, who's going to be born right before the assembly. But then I will be coming back and doing reader training webinars to get the readers ready for reading week that begins on the Monday in about 10 days.
Gotcha. Well, congratulations on your grandson, and
thank you.
And good luck with all the work that lies ahead for you and your entire staff between now and the middle of July.
Thank you very much.
Okay, folks. Well, like they say on Car Talk, you have wasted another perfectly good hour of your lives sitting and listening to Presbyterians talk about Presbyterian stuff. But we trust and hope, actually, I'm not going to do the Car Talk thing. I'm going to say I think that at least I have found that a well-used 6 hours this week, and I hope that you have as well. Mr. Givler, do we have anything that the rest of the group we ought to hear before we sign off, particularly of a logistical or mechanical nature?
I don't think so. Again, I'll post these videos on the Synod's YouTube channel, and I have a document with some questions from Tuesday, some links from today that I'll also include, so you'll have that at your fingertips as well. So look for that hopefully tomorrow.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We will see you when and where we see you, and thank you again for your willingness to step up to this kind of service in the church. Even as the conversations have gone forward, it's clear that without folks in the seats on the bus that you occupy, the way of the Presbyterian ethos would struggle much more. So we appreciate the service that you provide for your presbyteries and to the congregations therein, and pray that it would be met by the power of the Spirit in ways that we don't even expect.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for this. This has been very helpful.